to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of revivalism and reform in the antebellum era. And as much as things were trying to improve in society, there were many Americans who still felt that things were out of control and needed even a more extreme version of reform. That is, to separate themselves completely from society and start a new society of their own. This is broadly known as Utopianism, trying to create a perfect society separated from the rest of society. There were dozens of these societies that sprang up in the antebellum era. Some of them were associated with religious groups and incorporated many unique and interesting doctrines. Others were secular in nature. Sometimes they advocated things like eugenics, trying to pair off perfect couples or to govern relationships in other ways. But all of these societies suggested that despite the ongoing reform efforts within society, there were still many Americans dissatisfied with society as it existed at that time. Let's talk first about some of the utopian societies that were religious in nature. A number of different groups sprang up around the belief that the millennium was imminent and Judgment Day would soon be upon us. This idea is broadly known as millennialism and attracted many followers in the antebellum decades. William Miller, for instance, predicted that Christ would return in March of 1843. When that prediction failed, he made a new prediction that it would occur on October 22nd, 1844. And when that one failed, his group began to lose faith and fade away. But other similar groups sprang up in different parts of the country and at different times. One can imagine that these kinds of predictions can only go on so long before people lose faith in the nature of that prediction. One of the most widespread and successful utopian groups was the Shakers, or the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing. Their teachings were based on a figure called Mother Ann Lee, who had been abused by her husband and had 4 children die in childbirth. And we can imagine such traumatic experience as this led her to believe that sex itself was the root of human evil. And so she began to preach a certain kind of lifestyle that came to be known as the Shakers. This was in part due to the kind of dancing and movements that the Shakers engaged in during their ceremonies, often kind of tramping around, as you can see in this painting. Mother Ann Lee had some pretty radical ideas about sexuality and equality. And as this group practiced celibacy, there were no children, there were no husbands and wives within the Shakers. They called themselves simply brothers and sisters. And Mother Ann Lee believed that God was a combination of masculine and feminine, and that women and men were equal. And essentially, that was how the gender relationship evolved within the Shaker community. They also participated in the growing market economy in a way that was distinct from other utopias. Many utopias didn't adopt individual ownership of things. They believed in communal ownership, and the Shakers did as well. However, they did believe in marketing their goods and products, and so they would make furniture and other things. They would sell agricultural products, and so they actually participated in the market economy even if they didn't endorse individual property ownership. Another noteworthy utopian community sprang up around Oneida, New York, and might be called the Oneida Community. It was established by John Humphrey Noyes, who was a minister educated at Yale, and he believed in a doctrine called perfectionism, that one could attain a state of perfect holiness here on earth. And so within the Oneida community, there were lots of different behavioral limitations that would suggest whether you had indeed achieved perfectionism or not. Now, the Oneida community embraced a still more radical idea related to this, and that is the idea of complex marriage. This meant that any man or woman in the community who had achieved perfectionism could engage in sexual relations with any other person of the opposite sex. This kind of free love was very radical for its day and not accepted in most parts of the country. Those in the Oneida community also practiced eugenics, trying to create ideal children by pairing together ideal parents who had achieved perfectionism. So the Oneida community embraced a number of radical beliefs and practices for its day. A final religious utopian group that I want to mention are the Mormons, established by Joseph Smith, who grew up in western New York and was influenced by the intense religiosity of the Great Awakening. Now, according to this belief system, Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon in 1830, and a community was established in Palmyra, New York around that time to embrace these beliefs. Mormons eventually set up a community in Kirtland, Ohio, and then several others. While Mormons were perhaps not as committed to communism as the Oneida community or the Shakers, they did encourage their members to donate their land and goods to the community to be redistributed, although they didn't mandate it as thoroughly as some of the other utopian communities. Other utopian experiments were less rooted in religious beliefs, but had similar kinds of community values as some of the other utopias we've discussed. So a number of these sprang up out of frustration with some of the market forces we talked about in previous lectures. New Harmony in Indiana, which was established by Robert Owen, was one such experiment. Other utopian sites were established around the theories of Charles Fourier, a French theorist who believed in ideal communities based on socialist ideals. Now, again, this is not a religious idea, it's more of an economic one, that all the profits produced within a community would be shared equally amongst all of the participants. Fourier also advocated absolute equality between men and women, and within his communities, men and women were paid equally and had equal benefits within the community. Another noteworthy utopian experiment was born at Brook Farm in Massachusetts, not far from Boston. And at Brook Farm, all manual labor was also supplemented by intellectual activity, such as reading and writing poetry and having lectures and conversations. They also believed in communal ownership and sharing both work and profits equally among all of the members of the community. There are far too many of these utopian experiments all across the country to list and discuss them individually. This gives you some general idea about the qualities embraced by a number of these utopias, and again indicate that many people across the country remained frustrated with the challenges in the cities and the challenges created by the market economy that we've discussed in previous lectures.